Hello from the National Arts Club in New York. I'm Susan Sarandon. In 1927, a young graduate student named Joseph Campbell arrived in Paris to spend a year studying Old French and the Arthurian romances. Soon after he arrived, he bought a copy of Ulysses by James Joyce, then notorious and banned in the United States. Like many readers before and since, Campbell was overwhelmed by the dense prose and heady themes in Joyce's masterpiece. When he went back to the store, the bookseller happily sold him a stack of books on themes ranging from modern psychology to Eastern religion to the Romantic philosophers. As Joe would later say, that changed my career. When looking at the myth-making power of art, Campbell would frequently point to two of the great modernist authors. The first, of course, was Joyce. The second was Thomas Mann, who may be less widely known in the English-speaking world, but who had very much the same revolutionary impact on modern art and thought.
I think the best way to get into Thomas Mann, if you've never read any of his things at all, is to read his short stories. His early short stories, they're marvelous. They are crafted. And it's there that he's working out his aesthetics. And the problem was life or art. On the life side, you're judging in terms of ethics and self-protection and that whole system. Art, bang, you open up, and how do you do it? After he had written Buddenbrooks, this book was ready for the press by 1900, and that is before Freud had published the interpretation of dreams. So that you'll see when you read it that Mann is full of the same dynamic that the Freudian discovery of the unconscious, which was no discovery, represents. And there you had this leitmotif, the Wagnerian theme of the returning echo and so forth, and a great sea, a great epic work. Then he wrote Tonio Carrera. That is the key work for, and he says so himself, for the rest of his life. Now the name Tonio Carrera lets you know that this is a person with two inheritances. His father is a North German businessman, and his mother is of Mediterranean race, Tonio Anthony Carrera. And up there, you know, when you're in Holland or North Germany, you see a lot of blue-eyed blondes. Well, Tonio had dark eyes and dark hair. So he was exceptional. And so he felt sorry for himself. And so he had the first prerequisites for becoming an artist. Considering himself as interesting and different. He found, however, that he did admire those beautiful blue-eyed blondes. And there were two in particular, a young boy, Hans, and a beautiful girl, Ingeborg, and he gave his heart to them. But, oh, he was more complicated. And he'd go to a party and they were dancing and enjoying life, but he was, you know, thinking about himself. And the girls he got were the ones that fell down when they danced. And so in his youth, he decides he's going to be an artist, a literary man, and he goes south, probably to Munich. And there he gets in with a group of what in those days were called bohemians. I say, people who couldn't do very much. They were not life competent, and so they were critics of life, like literary people in general. And they had very high ideals of what life should be like, which they applied to other people. And they, in their writing, were largely critics. And he felt just as ill-placed among this bunch of intellectuals as he had felt with the blue-eyed blondes. Besides, he'd given his heart to them. And to have them simply dealt with as though they were, you know, inferior beings to this bunch that couldn't even, you know, ski, he didn't think that was too great. So he separated himself from them, and this is where Thomas Mann get the idea of der verehrte Bürger, the lost Bürger, the person who is neither this nor that, zwischen zwei Welten, between two worlds. He's neither there nor over here, he's between the two. And he writes a letter back to the queen bee of the circle that he had been among. And her name was Lizaveta. She was a Russian. And Mann had something about Russians. In the Magic Mountain, it's Claudia the Russian with her Tatar eyes and all. And so he writes back to Lizaveta. And he said, in this wonderful letter, it's his you know, statement of thesis and how he was going to work. He says, I admire all of you ethereal people, so removed from life and able in your criticism. And your talent for le mot juste, the correct word, just to nail the person. You can see the fault, and you nail the fault. But he said, my heart is with those people. And he said, here we are, between criticism and love. And it is the function of the author, of the writer, to name. And what you name are the faults, because it's the faults that distinguish us from each other. But it's the faults that make us human. Who loves perfection? The Buddhas are perfect, so they don't come back. They don't become reincarnated. Imperfection is life. Do you love life? You love the imperfection. And so here is the secret of Mann's art, the absolutely ruthless eye, which sends the arrow of the correct word to name that fault, and on the arrow is an ointment of love. This he called erotic irony. He called it also plastic irony, and it's the secret of Thomas Mann's art. You name the negative, and with it, you bring the positive in. This is life. You must amor fati, the love of fate. Every act is an act of violence against the will of others. And there you are. This is Mann's plastic irony, and he holds it. It's one of the really marvelous things about his art. This is based on Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy again. At the end of the Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche has a paragraph in which he gives an image that epitomizes the sense of his paper. We are in a beautiful classic landscape with lovely people in decorous, beautiful movements, harmonious, the classical Mediterranean image of the classical world. And we're looking at these. This is the Apollonian beauty, the decorum and elegance and comeliness of people in relationship to each other. And then we look around, and here is a Dionysian temple of hideous hags tearing infants apart. And in the Dionysian ceremonies, they tore apart not only animals, but creatures, little children as well. This is death. This is the destruction of forms, the destruction of everything lovely. And here is beauty. And the depth of the realization of the horrific aspect of life is a function of the concentration on the beauty and comeliness. Now we'll find in the Magic Mountain, when we come to the culminating scene of Hans Castorp's illumination, out in the snow where he falls asleep, he has exactly that image.
Like Tonio Kruger, Thomas Mann was the child of mixed heritages. His father was a good Lutheran from Lübeck, while his mother, as Mann put it, first saw the light of day in Rio de Janeiro as the daughter of a German plantation owner and a Portuguese Creole Brazilian. It's unclear whether this mix, unusual in 19th century Europe, had as strong an effect on Mann's perspective as it did on his protagonists. Even so, as he wrote what would become his masterpiece, The Magic Mountain, Mann's erotic irony, his unique ability to see ruthlessly and yet love what he saw, faults and all, gave his writing its enduring mythic power.
Then he actually went to Davos in Switzerland with his wife. This was in 1912, which was, again, for consumptives, a sanatorium in the mountains. And I don't think he spent more than 2 or 3 weeks there. But the idea for a book came into his mind of a young man in this, you might say, ethically dangerous place. There are 2 concerns there: death and sex. And he saw death as the educator. We're on the way to the Magic Mountain. Death as the educator. The Lord Death. And his consort, Lady Lust. There were only one thing they were interested in there was temperature. Well, he got the idea of a young man in this dangerous environment with these 2 archetypal teachers, death and just sheer lust, between 2 pedagogues. And they came back home and the war started, First World War. And then with the end of the war, he began to take up that story again that he had in mind before, namely of the sanatorium and a young man between 2 pedagogues, and all the material that he had tossed around during those 4 years in the Betrachtungen comes back in the Magic Mountain, now balanced and ordered and put together. It starts with a young German, he's 23 years old, named Hans Castorp, C-A-S-T-O-R-P. And Hans, perfectly decent young man, just got a job. He became an engineer, a naval engineer, and he got a job. But he wasn't tremendously interested in his work. It wasn't his, whole life. People have to get a job. He got that job. He preferred his Maria Mancini cigar and his holidays. That's to say, his life wasn't in his work, it was in the holiday. He's much more over on the holiday side than the work side, and this is what's going to carry him to his, well, we might call it psychological death. Well, the doctor thought that he needed a holiday. So he has a cousin, Joachim, who's in Davos at the sanatorium there called Berghof, a mountain court or mountain castle. And the doctor suggests, well, why don't you go up for about 3 weeks and visit your cousin? You'll be up there in the Alps and so forth, and I'll be just fine. Now this is the main theme. Where is the thrust of your life? Is it in your work or is it somewhere else? The work is attached to the daily round, the world of time, of temporality, and where you're living, and of course in our culture world, the cycle of the seasons. The trees put on their leaves, the trees lose their leaves, the trees put their leaves on again, the trees lose their leaves. Hans gets into this wonderful Swiss train, and it goes up, and presently you don't have the trees that are putting on their leaves and losing their leaves and putting them on and losing them. You have evergreen trees and snow. So we've left time behind. That's the first big thing here. He has left the world of temporality behind. Man makes a big point of this, climbing, climbing, climbing. Also, the air is becoming thinner and thinner and thinner. And his heart begins to beat as though he were falling in love. In other words, he's ready to fall in love because he's already fallen in love with nobody in particular, or with nothing in particular, so anything there is ready to grab him, you know. So when he gets out of the train, way up there, he's in a when's it coming kind of condition, only he doesn't even know that that's what the situation is. He's moved out of time into the field of the everlasting, the eternal snows. Man uses the term 3 or 4 times there. The eternal snows and the eternal trees that never, no time. Also, they're not going to read the daily newspapers. They don't know what's going on. Now, Man uses the term hermetic pedagogy to describe what's happened here. Formerly, on our campuses, we never read modern novels. We did not read the daily newspapers. We were hermetically sealed from the journalism of the day, what was happening the day. And instead of always responding to, oh, now what about MXs, and now what about, you know, this, that, or the other thing, picket lines over here, and this, that, and the other kind, you are in touch with eternal concerns. You're reading Plato and Aristotle and so forth and so on. Hermetic pedagogy. Hermes is the god who guides people into the realm of death and the knowledge of eternal life. He is the Lord who leads through death to eternal life. Now this is where we're coming. Hermes, the Latin or Roman god, equivalent to Hermes, is Mercury. So Mercury is going to be Hans's guide, but the thermometer. And the temperature, the heat and all, you see? Okay. We've come into the realm of Hermes. Also, we're cut off, hermetically sealed. A tin can in which you have peaches is sealed away from time. So that peach has been in there for 6 years. You open the can, it's just as fresh and lovely as it was before. So Hans is getting out of the field of time into the field of Hermes, who not only has cut him off from the cycles of the year, but also is to become his guide, to tell him when he can sit up and when he can lie down and all this thing from the temperature. He is met at the railroad station by Joachim. Now Joachim actually is sick unto death. He's going to die. But what greets Hans is this fresh athlete. He's been out in the sun. He's a soldier, a young soldier, disciplined, in the work of King Death, the military. Hans is greeted by King Death wearing the mask of life. He meets the first of the 2 pedagogues. This is in Italian, Settembrini. Now, Settembrini is what used to be called the liberal. He wears check trousers, black and white. He knows the difference between black and white. He's a pedagogue. He's a social preacher. His trousers are old, but they're kept nicely pressed. So are his ideas. He's got a little mustache, and he talks and talks and talks. And Hans can't help but think of him as an Italian organ grinder, grinding out the same old tunes, you know, with the little monkey going out to get pennies. And also an Italian eye for the girls. All this goes together, basic. The chapter where he's introduced is called Satana, and throughout he plays the role of Mephistopheles in Goethe's Faust. And so we begin to know we're doing a repeat on the Faust theme. And Goethe's Faust becomes more and more important and evident as you go into the Magic Mountain. I'll come back to that a little later. So he meets Settembrini. When Settembrini starts talking with him, he already says, "A young engineer, you should go right home. Don't stay up here in this dangerous place. Go right home. You are avoiding your duty to society," and all that kind of thing. And Hans stays. Hans also meets the two doctors that are running the place, Dr. Behrens and Dr. Krakowski. Behrens wears a white smock and Krakowski black. Krakowski is the psychoanalyst, taking people's spiritual temperatures, and Behrens is the really owner and proprietor of the whole institution. And when Settembrini talks about Krakowski, he says, of the two of them, he says that they know all our women's secrets, and Krakowski has only one thought in mind, and that's a dirty one. So this is the Italian organ grinder's verdict on the two doctors. Neither of them is well. It's the sick doctor. So we've met the beginning now. The Lord Death, Lady Lust, the two interpreters of the world, one in the way of psychological and the other in the way of physiological symptoms. Which is the cause and which the effect? That all stays unanswered. And Settembrini, who is the first of the two pedagogues. Pedagogue number 2 will not appear until the beginning of volume 2. So we're going to spend the first part of the first volume gradually moving into the sphere of the Lord Death and Lady Lust, losing control increasingly. At breakfast, I guess it was, Hans hears the door slam behind him, and he thinks, "Gosh, what's that?" But stupid, rude kind of person, and he's so engaged in conversation he can't turn around to see what it is. Well, a couple of days later, he's at the dining room again at his table, and the door slams at the fish course. And he turns around, and he's hooked. This is Lady Lust. This is Claudia Schochat from the Bäderischen table. And what he sees is a woman with a rather tightly fit sweater, hand up, adjusting her hair, and the other in her pocket, walking to the table. Now, the fish, this is the animal of Aphrodite. And the fish meal takes place on Friday, Freya's day, Aphrodite's day, Venus's day. It's associated also with Osiris and the dead and resurrected God. Also, Friday is the Good Friday, when Christ died for love on the cross. And so Hans is hooked and he's on his way. That night, there was blood on his handkerchief. So this is the beginning of him losing himself to the allure of the mountain. Now, it's from that point on that the book begins moving through Goethe's classical Walpurgisnacht. So I want to say a word or two about Goethe's Faust, because that's where we are. The story of Faust is of a man who had given his whole life to learning, to scholarship, and he was doctor and master and everything else, but had missed life. And when he's moderately old, he thinks, oh, what of it? And so he's about to drink a poison, but it's Easter, and he hears the church bells ringing. And he thinks, oh, why don't I go out for a walk first and just take another look. And hear all these fresh young people, the Bauern, the peasant people. And his life, he has, as it were, killed himself and been reawakened to life. He's followed back home by a poodle. And the poodle won't enter the door because there's a pentagram written on the floor, and well, he has to go around it and so forth. A lot of rules. And then the poodle becomes Mephistopheles. And Mephistopheles says, well, I'll give you a whole lifetime to live again in exchange for your soul. But there's a certain condition. If Mephistopheles can get Faust to say, this is what I'm living for. This moment is the culminating moment. This is it. Then I've got you. Okay, says Faust. I don't think he can do it. Now, the wonderful thing about Faust is Mephistopheles is a technician. He can furnish the means to enable Faust to attain anything he wants. But he cannot control what Faust is going to want. Do you see the relationship here? This technician corresponds to the mental character within us. This is our Mephistopheles. The dynamic of life comes from that body, of which the brain is but one organ. When the brain tries to dictate what life should have, it obstructs life. And then the devil gets you. If the devil could fix it so that Faust could be given what Faust really, what his life really felt was the harmonious fulfillment, he would have him. We can never do it. So what we're getting from Settembrini is this kind of legal and orderly machinery, but with no control over the dynamic of our hero's desire system. Well, very soon, Hans has been listening to Settembrini's talk about society and all this kind of thing that we get from our sociologists. And then he goes into Behrens' study or office with his cousin Joachim. And Behrens shows him through a fluoroscope the skeleton of his own body, you know. He can see Joachim's lungs. He sees his own skeleton as though he were looking into his own grave. This is another dimension of life that Mephistopheles' Cerebrini has nothing to do with. Now, the chapter in which Mann is describing Sedembrini's activity is called Encyclopedics, Encyclopedia, the encyclopedists of the 18th century, the French Enlightenment. This is supposed to be enlightenment, all this stuff about society. But then we go into the doctor's office and we see death within life. Life and death are the same thing. They're not two different things. It's not black and white checked trousers. We can't talk that way anymore. Hans says to the doctor, "What is life?" And the doctor says, "Oxidation." And he says to the doctor, "Well, what is death?" And the doctor says, "Oxidation." And Hans says, "Oh, well, what's the difference?" And the doctor said, "Life is oxidation that holds its form." So form becomes the key word here, the holding your form. And it's oxidation, disintegration, holding a form. Then Hans goes to a lecture on psychoanalysis by Krakowski. And in front of him is Claudia with bare arm on the feet like this. And it's wonderful the way Mann describes it, with Hans looking at that arm and pinching his lips. This is impulse and restraint, you know. And his handkerchief has more blood on it that night. The build-up of this excitement moves to the next step when he goes into Baron's study and sees a portrait of Claudia on the doctor's wall. Not a very good portrait. It was painted by the doctor himself. But there was something very interesting about it, and it fascinated Hans. And the doctor said, yes, if you know what is under the skin, you can get certain effects. So there's Hans trying to see what's under the skin in the painting, and he becomes very much interested in what's under the skin. And so he moves now from just the interest in death to science. He starts studying biology, and all to know more and more about Claudia. Here we're following Faust. When Faust receives the gift of youth, the first thing in a magician or an alchemist's studio or shop, or whatever you want to call it, is this image of woman, just pure woman. And then the specific woman becomes then Gretchen. And so we already have the specific woman that's going to carry Hans on in his life. So he gives his rest hours to study, and he studies biology, and this leads him on to something else, and he finally ends with astronomy, so that the whole cycling of the heavens seems the same body that is of Claudia. The wonderful picture by Ingres of Oedipus and the Sphinx, the female Sphinx. And the Sphinx, the front part of her body is a woman's body, and then the back part is an animal body, and then that opens out into the rocks of nature and all. The woman becomes the guide to the whole sympathy with nature on Hans's part. The specific chapter in Goethe's Faust that we're working on now is Act 2 of Part 2, what's called the Classical Walpurgis Night. And I suggest you, those of you who've already read the magic mountain and are interested should just get hold of Part 2 of Faust and read. Act 1 has to do with the Gothic period. Act 3 has to do with the classical period, the 18th century. And this is represented in Faust as the marriage of Faust and Helen. Faust, the North European romantic, and Helen, the symbol of the classical world. And then between the two, Act 2 has to do with Faust going to Helen. And Helen is, of course, she's dead, so she's in the world of the dead, so is Claudia in the world of the dead. Hans is in the role of Faust, Claudia is in the role of Helen of Troy. And Faust's on the way to her. First, the image of woman, and then, together with Mephistopheles, Faust on a magic carpet flies to the world of classical myth. And when they come to the Sphinx, this part is a woman and this part an animal. This is where they separate. Mephistopheles takes the animal route and goes from one grotesque monster to another, and Faust follows the head route and finally ends up with Helen of Troy. This is where the two attitudes of the male to the woman go apart. The one that sees her with the eye of lust, and the other with the eye of awe and worship of the mystery that she incarnates. And Hans then follows Claudia in that sense. So we have first death, then we have the allure of the décolleté of Claudia in this painting, which knows something about what's under the skin. And then his study of science, which is called Researches. Then Hans becomes interested in visiting the moribund, those who are about to die. And so he has entered the realm of Persephone, the goddess of the underworld, in which realm Helen exists. Well, the climax of this first part comes at a party, a kind of Saturnalian Mardi Gras party, where all the rules of the institution are for one night disregarded. People can drink, people can break all the rules and so forth, and they're wearing costumes, and Hans gets drunk, and there's a game they play. The game is, when you're blindfolded, to draw a pig. The pig, we're in Circe's realm, who turns men into swine, and Hans is going to be turned into a nice little swine. When Faust goes to find Helen, Mephistopheles gives him a key, a magic key that guides him to her. So when it comes time to draw the pig, Hans has the nerve to go to Claudia and ask, "Do you have a pencil?" And she gives him the pencil with which to draw the pig. And that puts him in touch with her. It's the first time he's ever spoken to her. And he's quite drunk. And when the rest clear out, she's left, and he's left with her. He goes down on his knees. Now, in a kind of Germanic French, he tells her of the wonder of her body, the wonderful symmetry of her ribs, and the wonderful delicacy of her backbone, and the symmetry of her breasts and her shoulders and so forth. And she's a sophisticated woman, and she lets this thing go on. And when he's finished this most clinical kind of poetic praise, she just has a little triangular paper cap on her head, and she puts the paper cap on his head, and she says, "N'oubliez pas de me rendre mon crayon." Don't forget to return my pencil. And leaves him. So that's the end of volume 1.
The first volume of The Magic Mountain follows Hans Castorp's sometimes comic, sometimes frightening journey from his flatland home to the mountain palace of King Death. Now he's at the threshold of the Mountain Queen. If he steps across, will he ever be able to return? Or will he find himself trapped, like Persephone in the underworld?
And volume 2 now begins. Hans is an old-timer on the mountain. And Claudia isn't there. She has left. She's gone down to the flatland for a visit. She'll be back, but she isn't there. But then Settembrini introduces him to the second pedagogue. Now, the second pedagogue is Nafta. And he lives in town. Nafta is a Jew, a Jesuit, a communist. And then begins this long dialogue of Nafta and Settembrini, the two pedagogues, one for what might be called the former revolution, the one of democracy, the democratic revolution, and now the communist revolution. And are they different? And they use many of the same words. Now, I once met Thomas Mann, and we were talking together, and we were talking about the Magic Mountain, and he said he had made a mistake, that it was too wordy, that there was too much talk. Well, I felt that wasn't true, but for me, that conversation, I don't know how it is now, but in those years of my own middle age, you might say, these were the big arguments that were going on. And Mann had worked the whole thing out. But then the climax comes in a speech that Nafta makes. And when I read it, I thought, my God, who would talk like that? But after teaching at Sarah Lawrence for 38 years, I heard nothing else. What the youth wants is not freedom, but the whip and the terror. And it's that that's coming into the world, and the whole darn thing is right there out in front. And didn't it ever dawn on you that the idea of the church and the idea of the communist state are the same? That capitalism, individualism, this is the sin, and so forth and so on. You get the whole thing right like that. So he could darn well be, without, you know, any division, be the Jew, the Jesuit, and the communist at the same time. And this goes on, and here's Hans and Joachim listening between these things, and Hans trying to figure it out. Then comes the great climax to this. Hans thinks he'll go skiing. Now, this wonderful scene of Hans on his skis. And he can't ski very well, but Mann makes a point, if you really want to do something, you can do it well enough. I mean, if it's part of your requirement for your development and all, and it seems to have been for Hans that he should go scooting around on skis. So he goes out one fine day, and he has in his back pocket a bottle of port wine to give him strength. And he's getting to be pretty worn out. He's pretty far away, and he sees a little house down the way, a little hut. And he leans up against it and takes a drink of the port to give him strength, but what it does is put him to sleep. And he has the dream, the beautiful dream. And what it is the dream of the last paragraph of Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy. The beautiful classical people and the hags tearing children apart. And it says the same message. It's the message of life and death. And Hans has this term in his mind that he has got from Nafta, Homo Dei, the man of God, who is master, really, of the pair of opposites, and more noble than life and more noble than death is the nobility of the human spirit. And one must regard life, keep one's mind on the life side with silent knowledge of the temple of the abomination. It's there. It's in life. There's no point in saying it isn't there, because then you don't have life. Not only is it part of life, it is life. It's the death aspect that's tearing us apart. It's a wonderful solution that he brings forth that's beautifully, beautifully rendered. Settembrini is on the side of life. Now we've got to have another symbol for the life side also, and conveniently he appears. The Claudia has entered the dining room one day, but the door didn't slam. Why? Because this tall, lean, athletic, and suntanned Dutchman behind her, Herr Peppercorn, has followed her and caught the door and closed it quietly. So she has returned with a lover. Well, this is kind of tough on Hans a little bit, and it's tough on everybody in a way, but there's Claudia. And then comes this description of this wonderful man who never completes a sentence. He's just the opposite to Nafta and Settembrini. But it's his genial personality that is important. He is the Homo Dei, the man of God. And a gentleman, a Dutch merchant. He's been in the East Indies, and he has a Malay servant, and so on, but he's going to die. And so we have these chapters of these two deaths. The one is Joachim's death, the true good soldier, who went down before he should have left the mountain to perform his duty, but then came back. And he also had been in love with a Russian girl, Marussia. And Hans thinks Marussia was what brought him back, and he hadn't worked it out. And then comes what I think is the final koan, the final Zen mystery story of the whole piece. Peppercorn invites a whole bunch of these one-lungers and everything else to a picnic. And it includes Nafta and Settembrini, the two chatterboxes. And he brings them to a waterfall, an enormous waterfall. Of course, the noise makes it so you can't hear anybody, so Nafta and Settembrini are wiped out. But his personality isn't wiped out at all. And there's a lovely scene where they stand in front of the waterfall, admiring it, talking to each other. They can't understand what anybody's saying about the wonders of the waterfall. Then they go for a walk up one side of the waterfall, across a little bridge, and when they're in the middle of the bridge, they wave to the people down there. They're coming down again. It's symbolic of the cycle of life. It's not for anything. It's for the delight. It's the lila, the play, the joy. That's the explanation of what life's all about. Then they come back, and he gives a talk, his final talk, with a cup. And it's like the chalice. And as Mon says, sometimes he resembles a priest, at other times a pagan mystagogue, you know, talking and so on, and everybody listening can't hear a thing. That's the koan at the end of the piece. What counts is character. What counts is personality. What counts is life, not all the talk. And talk itself is an expression of life, and those other two were putting their talk on top of it. That's the final koan of the piece. And Peppercorn takes a pill and gets rid of himself. Here he is, and he uses a very telling term there. He says, Das Leben ist ein ausgestrecktes Weib. Life is a woman laid out waiting for you. And if you're not up to this, let's go. And so he takes his poison. It's a beautiful moment. So then what about Hans? There's this funny final scene between Nafta and Settembrini where they get into such a collision that Nafta challenges Settembrini to a duel with pistols. And there they are, so many paces apart. Settembrini's time to shoot. Settembrini wouldn't shoot to kill anybody. And Nafta then shoots himself. Makes me think of Hitler at the final bunker there where he killed himself. So Hans, now everything's unstrung, the war is coming, and Mons making it that you feel it coming. It's in the air of Europe, because that First World War was a lot of nonsense. It was about absolutely nothing whatsoever, and nobody knows why it took place. Except they had a lot of treaties. If you hit that guy, I'm on his side, and so-and-so, and the whole thing just blew. Europe knocked itself out. And so it's coming. But Hans, he solved his problem, and so there's no more reason for him to be on the mountain. And the final thing then is the trumpet for the war blown. Hans doesn't have to go. He's in Switzerland. Now this is a chap who had a perfectly simple job. It was too much for him, so he goes away to have a holiday. After 7 years, he's called back to life. Which side is he going to go on? Settembrini's side, or the side where blood and nature calls? And he decides he's going to say yay to life on the side of his life at life's abyssal moment of war and the negative black temple of death side. He takes it that way. The only way to say yay to life is to say yay to life with what it gives, not I say yay with corrections. And so this is the magic mountain. We've left a life that we couldn't tolerate because we hadn't chosen it. We just moved into it. And we were not living life there. We go to the magic mountain and learn about life through death, and then we come right back to life. And there's Hans in the trenches at the end of the story.
When Joseph Campbell returned from Europe in September 1929, his mind was bursting with what he had learned and how all of it, from the novels of Mann and Joyce to the Hindu scripture to the psychology of Freud and Jung, informed his understanding of the Arthurian legends that he was studying. His horrified Columbia University advisors refused to allow him to expand the topic of his dissertation, and Campbell dropped out. A few weeks later, the Great Depression began, and Campbell, following his own bliss, began his own Hans Castorp-like retreat from the world, reading, writing, and traveling across the United States. Yet the powerful art and ideas to which he had been exposed continued to inform and enrich those years. Eventually, Joe returned, teaching first at his old prep school and then at Sarah Lawrence College, where he would remain for nearly 40 years. And he brought back with him the boon of the wisdom that these diverse teachings and his own astonishing insights provide in these very lectures.
there, you know, when you're in Holland or North Germany, you see a lot of blue-eyed blondes. Well, Tonio had dark eyes and dark hair. So he was exceptional. And so he felt sorry for himself. And so he had the first prerequisites for becoming an artist. Considering himself as interesting and different. He found, however, that he did admire those beautiful blue-eyed blondes. And there were two in particular, a young boy, Hans, and a beautiful girl, Ingeborg, and he gave his heart to them. But, oh, he was more complicated. And he'd go to a party and they were dancing and enjoying life, but he was, you know, thinking about himself. And the girls he got were the ones that fell down when they danced. And so in his youth, he decides he's going to be an artist, a literary man, and he goes south, probably to Munich. And there he gets in with a group of what in those days were called bohemians. I say, people who couldn't do very much. They were not life competent, and so they were critics of life, like literary people in general. And they had very high ideals of what life should be like, which they applied to other people. And they, in their writing, were largely critics. And he felt just as ill-placed among this.
Hello from the National Arts Club in New York. I'm Susan Sarandon. In 1927, a young graduate student named Joseph Campbell arrived in Paris to spend a year studying Old French and the Arthurian romances. Soon after he arrived, he bought a copy of Ulysses by James Joyce, then notorious and banned in the United States. Like many readers before and since, Campbell was overwhelmed by the dense prose and heady themes in Joyce's masterpiece. When he went back to the store, the bookseller happily sold him a stack of books on themes ranging from modern psychology to Eastern religion to the Romantic philosophers. As Joe would later say, that changed my career. When looking at the myth-making power of art, Campbell would frequently point to two of the great modernist authors. The first, of course, was Joyce. The second was Thomas Mann, who may be less widely known in the English-speaking world, but who had very much the same revolutionary impact on modern art and thought.
Bunch of intellectuals, as he had felt with the blue-eyed blondes. Besides, he'd given his heart to them. And to have them simply dealt with as though they were, you know, inferior beings to this bunch that couldn't even, you know, ski. He didn't think that was too great. So he separated himself from them, and this is where Thomas Mann got the idea of der verehrte Bürger, the lost Bürger. The person who is neither this nor that, zwischen zwei Welten, between two worlds. He's neither there nor over here, he's between the two. And he writes a letter back to the queen bee of the circle that he had been among. And her name was Lizaveta. She was a Russian. And Man had something about Russians. In the Magic Mountain, it's Claudia the Russian with her Tatar eyes and all. And so he writes back to Lizaveta. And he said, in this wonderful letter, it's his statement of thesis and how he was going to work. He says, I admire all of you ethereal people so removed from life and able in your criticism. And your talent for le mot juste, the correct word, just to nail the person. You can see the fault, and you nail the fault. But he said, my heart is with those people. And he said, here we are, between criticism and love. And it is the function of the author, of the writer, to name. And what you name are the faults, because it's the faults that distinguish us from each other. But it's the faults that make us human. Who loves perfection? The Buddhas are perfect, so they don't come back. They don't become reincarnated. Imperfection is life. Do you love life? You love the imperfection. And so here is the secret of man's art, the absolutely ruthless eye, which sends the arrow of the correct word to name that fault, and on the arrow is an ointment of love. This he called erotic irony. He called it also plastic irony, and it's the secret of Thomas Mann's art. You name the negative, and with it, you bring the positive in. This is life. You must amor fati, the love of fate. Every act is an act of violence against the will of others. And there you are. This is Mann's plastic irony, and he holds it. That it's one of the really marvelous things about his art. This is based on Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy again. At the end of the Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche has a paragraph in which he gives an image that epitomizes the sense of his paper. We are in... I think the best way to get into Thomas Mann, if you've never read any of his things at all, is to read his short stories. His early short stories, they're marvelous. They are crafted. And it's there that he's working out his aesthetics. And the problem was life or art. On the life side, you're judging in terms of ethics and self-protection and that whole system. Art, bang, you open up, and how do you do it? After he had written Buddenbrooks, this book was ready for the press by 1900, and that is before Freud had published the interpretation of dreams. So that you'll see when you read it that Mann is full of the same dynamic that the Freudian discovery of the unconscious, which was no discovery, represents. And there you had this leitmotif, the Wagnerian theme of the returning echo and so forth, and a great sea, a great epic work. Then he wrote Tonio Kruger. That is the key work for, and he says so himself, for the rest of his life. Now the name Tonio Kruger lets you know that this is a person with two inheritances. His father is a North German businessman, and his mother is of Mediterranean race, Tonio Anthony Kröger. And up